Thanks, everyone. So we're going to start off the next section of our session here by having a discussion around the Rural Commission that was announced yesterday, and we have some distinguished guests here. We have Irene d'Entremont, who is a member of the panel that was announced yesterday, and also we have Ray Ivany, who is chair of the commission. So I'll start off by introducing Ray. Ray became the 15th president and vice chancellor of Acadia in April of 2009. He's a native of Sydney, Nova Scotia, and was previously chair of the Workers' Compensation Board of Nova Scotia and principal of an accounting firm, Ivany and Associates. Between 1998 and 2005, he was president and CEO of the Nova Scotia Community College, and prior to that served as executive vice president of the University College of Cape Breton. He is a member with me on the board of Nova Scotia Business Inc., where he serves as vice chair, and a member of the Association of Universities and Colleges of Canada and Nova Scotia Power Inc. He's on the boards of those two organizations. Ray has a long history of executive leadership and community involvement in Nova Scotia and across Canada. During his tenure at Nova Scotia Community College, he led a period of transformation, rapid growth, and major expansion of campus infrastructure. Ray has also advised various levels of government through appointments to the National Roundtable on Environment and the Economy, Ontario Investing in Students Task Force, and the Nova Scotia Premier's Fiscal Management Task Force. His achievements has earned Ray several awards of distinction. He was granted an honorary Doctors of Letters from St. Thomas University in 2006, named to Maclean's Honor Roll of Top 10 Canadians Who Made a Difference in 2004, and the same year was the Halifax Chamber of Commerce Business Person of the Year. In 2011, he was inducted into the Atlantic Business Magazine Top 50 CEO Hall of Fame. So welcome, Ray, and thanks for coming.
Well, thanks very much, Simone, and it's a pleasure to be here, and I'd like to say that this was perfectly planned, but that wouldn't be accurate at all. Actually, Betty had contacted me several months back and asked me to sit on the panel that you had this morning, and I had a conflict already scheduled at that time on campus at Acadia and couldn't attend. And then events that I don't think either of us could have ever foreseen fell into place, and the commission was struck, and the announcement yesterday, and the opportunity to be with you today. So that part was less by design, but absolutely fortuitous. The part that is by design, when in fact we knew that the commission was going to be announced, was the opportunity to actually be here. I think couldn't be a more perfect way, from my perspective at least, I'm sure from Irene's as well, to spend a bit of time with you at the start of this process. And I'm going to go through probably a two-parter here. The second part will be sort of, if you like, the first official commission business. So I've got a bit of a presentation I want to walk you through, and I also want to get your advice, which again is to me the perfect timing of having launched this commission. As a group, we met for 3 or 4 hours yesterday, so we're very much just right on the front end of this, looking straight up. But there's no way that we're going to pass up an opportunity to have municipal leadership, chambers of commerce, RDA groups. You folks live in the world that we are now have a mandate to try to add some value to, and quite frankly, we just want to pick your brain. So we'll get to that component. Before we do that, I certainly don't have license from my fellow commissioners. I'm just going to talk to you as Ray Ivany and a fellow Nova Scotian, and probably declare some of my both biases and perspectives as we start this piece of work. And by all means, I'd like to get, and I'm sure I will, get your comments and advice on that. But I do need to draw a clear line that that's more me than anything official on behalf of the commission. Look, I mean, I'm still sort of grappling with the magnitude of the challenge that's been set for us, and I'd be disingenuous if I didn't tell you that I'm a bit daunted by the task. I love this province deeply. Grew up, as Simone noted, in Sydney, and I see some other Cape Bretoners in the room. Doesn't matter what province you're from, but you know, we all come as a product of our own lived reality. And mine is growing up in Sydney when it was industrial Cape Breton. And my dad worked for 44 years at the steel plant. I worked there in summers when I was going to school. And, you know, if for all intents and purposes, what was palpable there was a lack of control. And whether that be the historical ownership structures within the steel mill and the coal mines, or whether in fact it came from the cycle of economic development initiatives that we know all too well, and again, just didn't occur just in Cape Breton. But if you were really drawing up a backdrop of how we would not want to do it, I think the 40 or 50 years of that period in Cape Breton and elsewhere in the province would likely be very close to what you would draw up. So I come from a perspective on this, very deep perspective, that we can do better, and we can do better drawing on our resources and drawing on the strengths of the people and the communities in this province, than having someone else either come in to do it for us or to tell us how to do it. So you will see in the work of this commission a deep commitment. While we don't have all of the T's crossed and I's dotted yet, you'll see a deep commitment to a consultative process. The people in this room, again, one of the reasons why we're starting here today, and will continue throughout the work of the commission, to be in communities, listening to people, listening to your experience, finding out both things that work and things that don't work, because removing those, I think, can often be as important as adding something else that works. So we're going to try to be informed by the base of knowledge that's in this room and in many rooms around Nova Scotia, and it's out of that deep and abiding belief. And every one of you in this room can give examples from your particular communities. I was just chatting with Ian there briefly at lunch, and one of the very strong themes for me is the sheer power of entrepreneurs and entrepreneurial activity that, you know, at one level, and I realize there's some very expert planners and policy people in the room, but in many cases, the kind of economic activity that we see often will fly in the face. You know, what economic planner, as Ian pointed out, would ever said, we're going to build export-oriented ambulances in Yarmouth, right? Or knives in Pictou County, or right around this province. So, you know, governments of the day, leave this one aside in the current realm, you know, you could do a sector-based approach and strategy, and you could say, we're absolutely not going to do anything in Sector X. And my guess is, within several weeks or months, you'd see a successful business somewhere spring up in Sector X. Because it is not, if we've learned anything in this process, it is the indomitable spirit of the entrepreneur, the successful business, even in the communities that struggle absolutely deeply. And, you know, John Bragg made this point yesterday in our first meeting, and I thought it was really important. He said, look, you go into any community in this province, and you will find a or more than one entrepreneur. And you'll find people that have leadership capacity where they could be premier or prime minister. And you know this better than I do in your particular part of the province. But the challenge for us is how to harness that potential and energy. And this is where it starts to get, this is not a feel-good message at all, because if all of that was true on the scale that this province requires in order for us to have the kind of communities and the kind of economic success that we need, then we wouldn't be having this commission. And in many ways, you know, economic development, isn't it one of those classic fields? The only way to succeed in economic development is to put yourself out of a job, right? So that it's not needed because there's that much activity that occurs on its own inertia. But the reality is we haven't been able to do that as a province. And, you know, I look back, I think, you know, we have a storied history. I mean, I've often, you know, been the one citing the audiences, particularly those with a negative bent, and I suspect we'll be in front of several of those audiences in the next 18 months. You know, that long before any economist coined the term value added, it was deeply embedded in this province. So from the time we started fishing, because that's the resource that was here, we also, for a period, became among the very best shipbuilders in the world. And we exported that product and that know-how around the world. So we added value in that realm. But you also heard, or anybody that was at the press conference yesterday or some of the coverage, I don't think we can escape the reality, if I stay in the fishery, that we have not been able to build the additional layers beyond some of our primary sectors in the same way, and I use Norway as a comparator, in the same way that, you know, frustrates me, and I suspect those in the room, those close to the fishery, will frustrate you even more, that the Norwegians are great fisher people as well, but we also buy their gear on our boats, and so do hundreds of other countries around the world, because they were able to build those successive layers of economic activity on the primary resource. So the challenge for us, it seems to me, there's a fundamental scale challenge here, and you'll certainly see that as I go through the slides. But I'm starting out from a fundamental belief that that is something that we can make significant headway on. You know, for those, the economists in the room, look, and again, this is whether it's declaration of bias or at least opening set of perceptions. I was compelled by Robert Reich's analysis, actually before he served in Clinton's cabinet in the first term. Reich's analysis around wealth creation and economic activity. And if you recall, the U.S. was wringing its hands in the late 1990s because they were ceding control of some of their marquee brand corporations. At the time was the Japanese, strangely, that were doing most of the purchasing. So corporate control was being ceded. And Reich wrote several articles actually, but one really powerful article that I think in many ways was probably, it probably had more foresight than even he thought at the time, because it was just as we were sort of stepping into the knowledge economy. And what Reich said, and I think about, it's easy, we'd all say this now, but think about saying this, I think it was somewhere, gosh, it was probably late 80s, sort of not late 90s, it was probably late 80s. When he said this, he said, look, we're entering an age where, you know, capital can move at the touch of a button. We're seeing increased harmonization of trade regulation on a global basis, and this was long before globalization fully took hold. We are seeing a case where any individual company can locate wherever it wants. So you get all kinds of movement based on whether it's labor cost or whether it's based on some other consideration. He said, look, the only thing that is going, or at least the primary driver of wealth creation, is not going to be centrally ownership in the way that it had been for the previous 100 years. It is going to be when an economic activity, a product or a service, when it touches down in your nation state, how much value can you add to it? So if it touches down in your nation state, whether you control the corporate structure or otherwise, if you're able to add value to it that has currency in a global setting, then that value is going to be added to your nation state. And therefore, that's wealth that will accrue to you, whether again through the corporate and the taxation structure. But I thought it was an absolutely eloquent model or framework to think about the kind of value that we need to add in a competitive sense when anything touches down in Nova Scotia. And again, if you look at the individual businesses that have succeeded in this province and the entrepreneurs, and if you look at particularly the export businesses, and some of them very small and some of them larger, what you will see is where they outcompete is they outcompete on the basis of the value they add in the activity when it happens here. Otherwise, there's no compelling reason for it to occur here. It's not going to be done because somebody thinks it would be nice to do it here. And whether that's a local entrepreneur or whether that's a transnational company, that calculus will be the same. And that's one of the reasons why certainly my own professional career, my belief in education and training in this kind of world, what you have in your head and what you can translate into the work that you do becomes a major determinant of how much value you're going to be able to add. Now, the other piece in this that gives me great optimism, back again to our people and back to the notion of how do we create more economic activity, because again, I want to come back to that scale issue. If we simply do what we do now better, I don't think the scale is sufficient for us to succeed by a common definition of success I think we would come very quickly to in this room. And whether that's the vibrancy of our communities, whether it's municipalities having the tax base to provide the services that people want in their towns, whatever measure you might use, I think the challenge here is going to be a scale challenge. So we need to do more. Now, one of the things that again gives me, and I'm a little dated on this, but I know in my time when I was at the community college, we were party to a number of businesses, and the call centers come to mind. So anybody that has a call center bias or aversion, this may or may not resonate for you, but I've seen it happen in other sectors as well. But in those cases, we were attracting operations to the province where virtually every one of the major players had similar operations located in at least 2 or 3 or 4 other locations in either North America or somewhere else in the world. And anybody that knows the call center business, they are as heavily metricated as any operation that I've ever seen. So, down to individual efficiency of somebody on the phone to every other measure. That's just the nature of the business. So that level of metrication gave them incredibly powerful diagnostics on how one site compared to another. And the 4 or 5 major groupings of those call centers that we worked with directly at the time, within a year of establishing their operation in Nova Scotia, for every one of them, the top performing site for each of them was their Nova Scotia site. And I don't think it happened by accident. I think it happened because, and again, for each of you, you'll be able whether to think of the individuals involved or to be able to think of people in your community, the kind of approach that we have as a set of values, and this is where I think culture and the kind of social construct matters very, very deeply. The kind of approach that we have to our jobs brings a value that is very readily measured. There's all kinds of broader implications and wonderful characteristics that come from it, sense of humor and otherwise, but when it comes right to the absolute bottom line with those businesses, they absolutely could measure the difference that a Nova Scotia workforce provided. And, and we don't need to look much further just down the road from here I mean, you know, again, I'll declare my personal view. I think, you know, the Highliner story is one of the greatest business stories in Canada in the last 50 years. Just absolutely sensational. I mean, to go from a very storied fish harvesting company, largely, to a collapse in the stocks and the quotas, and now to become the largest North American value-added seafood processor is an incredible story. I mean, you know, think of your own analogy in your own world, right? I mean, you've got all of your capital investment, and what you're really good at is putting ships out to sea and catching fish. And then one day you're told you're not allowed to catch fish anymore. And that becomes a catalyst to produce a company that is now having this kind of success on the national stage. And if you talk to Henry about it, Henry will tell you a big part of that, a huge part of that, again, the people involved in the business, the nature of the set of values and the approach that they took. Look, we can do this. Like, we can do this. And look, in taking this on as much, again, just absolutely, it's the way I'm wired. I'll be straight up with you. Absolutely daunted by the challenge because, you know, I'm not naive. If this was easy or simple, we would have figured it out a long time ago. And there wouldn't be the need to look at it yet again. But I'm absolutely convinced. You know, as I said in one of the interviews, look, I'm absolutely acutely aware there are no magic answers. Yeah, I'm aware of that. But I absolutely believe there are answers. Right? They don't need to be magical. I mean, this is, you know, it's better to light a single candle than curse the darkness. Right? We can deal with this on the basis of one success after another success after another success. But there are a set of realities and challenges that I think we need to show some courage to deal with. And look, and I'll be honest, and I've done this, Simone and others will know, you know, I've done this before, you know, with audiences around economic development because you folks deal with this world. You know, if I'm rating Nova Scotia in terms of us having all the requisite pieces in order to succeed, right? We may quibble, right? But just think, do we have the resources that we need in order to succeed? And you can think about compared to other jurisdictions. You know, you may quibble about whether you give us a B or an A minus, but no one's going to say you've got an F on having the requisite pieces. And nor would I. I'd actually rate us, probably give us a B or B plus on that. But if you ask me to rate Nova Scotia on how good we are in connecting those pieces, I'd rate us much lower. You know, for whatever, and look, I'm from Cape Breton. We'd rather fight than eat, right? I mean, you know, there's not a chance that we're going to grow a pie if we can have a fight over the pie that's in front of us, right? And the energy that gets consumed in that is energy that could be expended, again, even if you want to use that simple metaphor, right, of growing the pie. But even forget that. You know, think of what we look like, and again, Simone's the one on the hot seat these days. Think of what we look like if, in fact, we are dealing with the business that we do want to attract here when we're in the middle of that fight, right? And again, I want to be absolutely respectful, particularly for the municipal leaders that are in the room. We've got structures that lead to some of those fights, right? I mean, if the tax base for you only occurs if it's located on one side of the line versus another, well, like, why are we surprised that people are going to want to have it on that side, on their side of the line? So, that's why I say look, anybody, I'm not absolutely given, I don't have the time to I just gave a lecture to one of our business classes a couple of weeks ago to sort of rip Jim Collins's good to great apart on some of the methodology. But I'll tell you one of the things in Collins that I absolutely am a believer in. And most people in the room will have read it. And you'll remember the Stockdale paradox, right? Jim Stockdale, a U.S. officer in the Vietnam War, captured, POW, tortured mercilessly for 7 years. And Stockdale in the middle of that, and every time I tell this story, I just think, I don't know how someone has the capacity to do it. But he held on to two sort of paradoxical views at the same time. One, he was in an absolutely the worst possible situation he'd ever been in his life, and it was as awful as it would sound. And secondly, that he was going to get through that. He didn't know how, but he was going to get through it. And the process of him having gone through that 7 years of torture was going to be so transformative and powerful in his life afterwards that he would never wish that it hadn't happened. I can't get myself there, right? But Collins used, if you recall, the Stockdale paradox as a way of reminding folks we all have a propensity to tell little white lies to ourselves. We all have a propensity to round off some of the sharp edges in looking at the brutal facts and the brutal reality that we're dealing with. But every time you round off those edges, or any time you avert your gaze from looking at the reality, you now limit your ability to deal with it. The other thing about Stockdale that I thought was absolutely powerful was the fact that, so he survived, right? He did survive, by the way, and got on the other side of it and did hold the belief that, in fact, it had transformed him. But Collins asked him when he was doing the interview, just almost as an aside, he said, well, you survived, who didn't? And Stockdale didn't even hesitate. He said the optimists didn't survive. Isn't that interesting? And the reason they didn't was that rather than deal with their reality, the brutal facts, what they did is that they told little white lies to themselves. So if it was the fall, they would say, look, we're going to get rescued and be out of here by Christmas. And then when they didn't get rescued by Christmas, they said, we're out of here by Easter. And when that didn't happen, they said, we'll be out of here by the summer. And they eventually died more of a broken heart than from the torture, because they just basically just could not deal with the reality. Now, again, we don't have to deal with it on those horrific terms, but do we as a province have to come to grips with what is it in a wonderful, wonderful part of the world with all of those positive things that I rattled through and you could rattle through even better in your part of the province? Why is it that we have not been able to make the kind of jump in scale that we absolutely need in order to succeed? So as we begin our work, and I'll make the turn here to walk through some of the early pieces for us. I think, we're approaching this from the standpoint that we are going to look at the brutal facts directly in the eye, right? We are not going to shy away from them one last bit. But secondly, we're looking at them in that way because we absolutely believe by doing so, we can find some of those perhaps not so magic answers, but we can find some of those magic answers that have held us back at least up until now, in terms of scaling the activity. And you can think about that at your community level. That's good. That's fine by me. Or you can think about it at a pan-provincial basis. But it's still the same question. We do need more scale in terms of economic activity in order to do what we and what anybody else would say we would want for our particular province. So that's kind of my starting point from it. Let me try to walk through this, and I'll try to do this more briskly than it will allow, or than it should, but we'll make sure, you can we'll get you the slides, and many of them you'll probably be familiar with as well, and there'll be something that'll be part of the work that we're going to do. So it's not you're only going to get one crack at seeing these. But let's just take a quick look through. So if you look at the population change, and again, you'll be able to pick out your part of the province. So this is 09 and then projections out to 2034. This won't surprise you, right? And this is where we think we'll be by then. And as you can see, overall population down by 4%. And then some unevenness in terms of where you're going to see where you're going to see those hits occur. And again, I'm not going to get hung up. This is sort of the official provincial set of projections. You'd see a different one in terms of, census or StatsCan projections off of census. It doesn't matter. The point is whether we're static, and I'll have another slide here that you get a quick look in a moment, but whether static or in slight decline, that's not the kind of population profile you'd want if you were drawing it up, right? And again, the only way you're going to see that be any different is there has got to be an economic drive in order for this to happen. I mean, again, we look at oat migration, but at least I know the communities that I live in, oat migration is a secondary. It's not a primary issue. It occurs because those young men and women in our communities, their first preference in almost every occasion would be to stay, if in fact the economic activity was there. The other thing that you're seeing is the aging of the population, and as the demographers say, I don't know why we're surprised by this. People have been getting 1 year older a year at a time for quite a while. But for some reason, it seems to have surprised us that, in fact, that's occurred. And it will color all kinds of issues. But there's opportunity in that as well. Now, this is the population scenario, and I'm not sure if I've got a light on this or not. Probably don't. Did I ever press the wrong button? Okay, there we go. Oh, yes, thank you. So at least for the folks on this side, I can't do much over there. But just to walk through these. So the red line is that official projection, right? So there you see our population headed down. The green line makes an assumption. The green line says if we get 10% higher immigration than what we're currently projecting each year, what happens? So it moderates slightly. The blue line says if we get 10% higher birth rates for each year than the base projection, we get another slight bump off of the current base. But the only one that really gives you a significant, even there, you're just basically treading water, but at least it gives you some flatness to the curve, is that interprovincial oat migration, so the net of people leaving the province versus coming to the province, if you get a 10% lower result than what's in the base case, that gives you quite a bump. So that will, again, you're going to see many flashes of insight into the obvious here, but the reason that gives you the bump is that's what the flux looks like in terms of, in many cases, people from this province who can't find employment here going west, right? So our net loss, and I don't mean that just in terms of people, but it is in people as well. Our net loss in people is dramatically affected by what's happening now in terms of inflow and outflow on a provincial basis. So, economic growth. All right, so let's use GDP as a measure. 90 to 2009. I actually think, again, maybe it's the optimist or realist in me, okay, so on an ordinal basis, we're at the bottom of the curve in Canada. But the positive that I see in that is, you know what? Like, take out the top two, or even the top. That's the Canada average. So take out the top couple here, and you're within sort of striking distance on a whole number of other provinces. And if you look at those provinces, like take a look at Saskatchewan here, if you take a look at those provinces in Newfoundland, take a look at them and take away the benefits that are accruing from essentially the resource industries associated with them, then there's lots underneath that tells me, again, our starting point has much to commend it. Now, again, you could say, well, that's really trying to put, as they say, lipstick on a pig, right? Given that you're sitting at the bottom of the heap. I don't think so, all right? I mean, again, look, I don't know about the rest of you, but, I mean, who among us was not horribly frustrated during McKenna's time in New Brunswick, where, the New Brunswick that McKenna was portraying, every time I heard him speak, and I've said this to Frank, every time I heard him speak, I thought he was talking about Nova Scotia, right? But they were able to portray New Brunswick in a way that, had much of the vibrancy that I thought existed in our province. So, you know, we need to get underneath this. Again, it's not all, I don't see this entirely as gloom and doom. I do see it, back again to confronting our brutal reality, is that just won't cut it, right? Again, I want to come back to the scale issue. That just won't cut it. And I'm not even all that worried about where the other provinces are. I mean, if you start translating that into certainly what works in my head, which is if you want to talk about wealth redistribution, you need to first talk about wealth creation. And if you can't create the kind of economic activity, even though people like us will run out long lists of what we want to do, when we have to come to grips with who's going to pay for that, ultimately it comes back to either directly or indirectly correlates of the level of economic activity. And that level of economic activity won't do it. It just won't do it. So this one takes a lot of clicks, so let me click it out. I think there's one more. Yeah, okay. So look, this goes 90 down to 2009, compares GDP growth in Canada, the red line, to GDP growth in Nova Scotia. The neat thing about this curve is a great reminder to all of us, because when you often look at the national data over periods of time and the provincial data on top of it, it looks like a nice smooth line, right? It looks like it's just going like that. Well, it's a little bit like a duck going across the water, right? On the surface, everything looks pretty calm, but if you get a look underneath the water line, there's a lot going on. Well, there's a lot going on through those periods. And in a relatively small province, you see changes that introduce almost disproportionate effects on our economy. So let's look at Nova Scotia. We had a rougher time back, remember the early to mid-90s and the Liberal government in Ottawa and their restraint, which they largely passed on to provinces, and then they passed it to municipalities, etc. Well, there it is, right? I mean, that just flattened us out while Canada was doing much better. Then the period in here is probably the closest thing, and I remember talking to Ian about this when we were both on the board of the chamber. That period that we had from sort of mid-90s to just over the millennium was probably the closest thing we've had in my lifetime, at least, to a broad-based economic uplift across a wide variety of sectors in our economy. It was one of the times when we did see a kind of a lift occurring broadly. Now, if we look at it, there were a couple of things that were happening, right? So we had the Sable project, which was full bore at the time. And again, back to my point about in a small jurisdiction, single events can have disproportionate impact. Remember when Stora Enso did the major refit of the new paper machines? I mean, that project was large enough, and I remember APEC pointing that out. That project's large enough to show up on our provincial GDP, and indeed it did, because look, during this period, we actually were above the Canadian number at points in time, but we were right there with it for much of that period. Then we all fall off the edge of the cliff, right? I mean, especially once we hit the 08 period. But then we dip down again, and as the slide notes, I mean, we're dealing with declining forest product output. We saw the gas starting to come off. The dollar was rising. That's the other thing in this period. Let's not pat ourselves on the back and strain a muscle. We were dealing with 65 or 70 cent dollars, right, in terms of comparison to the U.S. So here we go down again, and again, you see that nasty gap between Nova Scotia and the rest of the country. But remember, you got two variables moving at once. Once Alberta took off, and now Saskatchewan's taking off, the Canadian average is getting a lift from that. So even if we're standing still, we're declining. But it does show that gap opening up again. And then, of course, things crazy in sort of the post-2008 period, and now we're writing the rest of those lines. So let's do this in another way. Show the same thing, really. So back 90 to 97. So there's a period where, again, if you do it by major sector, you'll see some up, some down. We're basically treading water a little bit. to come back again to, my belief, and I think it's probably worth, many of us in the room were in our province during that time, to think back a little bit about what was happening. I'm looking at Fred Morley, and I know Fred has dug into this analysis. You saw, there's where you saw the uptick, and you were seeing it across a wide variety of sectors. And now we're back in a period where we're seeing some up and some down. So the point is that in each of these periods, we had a dynamic occurring in our province, some positive, some not so positive, often tremendous unevenness geographically, who was getting the benefit or who was taking the hit. But on any basis, and again, this I'll leave it, since we have not discussed it explicitly at the commission, I'll leave it as an Ivany comment rather than a commission comment. What screams out at me here is, even during this period, because that wasn't sustainable largely because of a 65-cent Canadian dollar, the scale is still not where we need it to be. And that's why you've heard me in the last couple of days, and you'll continue to hear, I'm using shipbuilding only because it is so big and it occurs over such a lengthy period of time, and it's in front of us. But on shipbuilding, the issue isn't for me, because I've got some faith in the Irving shipyards. Look, they'll build great ships. They'll run that project very well. I think, Simone and others are working hard to make sure we will see an extraction of benefits associated, and hopefully they drift out beyond HRM in terms of supply chains and otherwise. If that's what happens, I hope I live long enough. If that's what happens at the end of 25 years, I'll count it as a failure. Because the only way you're going to get scale out of that, along the lines that this province needs, the only way you're going to get scale is you're going to spin off tens, maybe more than that if we want to be bold about it, but tens of businesses that may have nothing to do with shipbuilding. They may have something to do with aerospace or electronics, but the shipbuilding activity creates the opportunity for some entrepreneur to learn some novel application or hone some piece of technology, and they can then sell that technology around the world. And if we've got a project this large over this period of time, if we don't set that as our target for the goal of having that project, I think we've set the bar way, way, way too low. It's just, and we're right on the front end of it. And again, there are lots of people thinking about it, so it's not like I'm saying that, desperately worried that it's not going to happen, but I think it's a great example of why the base economic activity that we've seen over the past number of decades isn't enough to get the kind of Nova Scotia we want. So if it isn't, then how do you leverage where you are now? How do you get that activity? It won't come solely from attracting businesses from elsewhere. It won't come solely by individual businesses in each of our community. That will be a contribution. So will businesses that come from elsewhere. It will come from, essentially, I think partly us getting some of the barriers out of the way, which I think will end up being a topic of our commission as well, and I'm fine, I'm okay with that. But it'll also be us seeing and exploiting, and I mean that in the most positive sense of the term, and exploiting opportunity that in previous generations, it was there for the taking. Use the fishery if it works for you. And we didn't see it. Like, I don't believe the Norwegians were smarter than us, right? Not for a moment. They certainly weren't better fishers than we were, but we get back to the brutal facts again. We've got to accept the fact that they were better than us at using what they learned in fishing to do other things that had economic value. And I just believe, again, go back to the entrepreneurs in your community. And again, I'm not closing the door to any sector-based discussion at all. I am just saying, you know, my own lived reality and experience. And again, it's wonderful to have Irene and John Bragg on the panel with us, because the power of individuals in the most unlikely places, in the most unlikely economic sectors, to do remarkable things. Like, you know, it's sort of like, duh. We've seen this so often that maybe we might want to embrace the fact that there's power there, there's energy there. And I think for governments often, what they do best is they set either conditions that make that more likely to happen, and more likely to happen in my schema more often, or they set conditions, again, back to how prescient Reich was in the late 80s, or they set conditions that cause the same people that are going to generate that economic activity, they'll do it somewhere else. And again, for those of you in this room that are involved in the economic development area, you know all that all too well. So that's the story just keeps coming back over and over for me to that. So this one is per capita private sector investment. So this is just basically a sense of how much money is getting invested. Again, back to my scale argument. If there's more activity to be exploited, and in fact the private sector sees the opportunity, they're going to invest in order to get it. But this one doesn't tell the kind of tale we'd want to hear. The blue line is Canada. The sort of blue with the gold, which is the bottom, at least in the latter years, is Nova Scotia. Red's New Brunswick, and I can't even tell what that other color is, but it's Manitoba. It's goldish, I guess. But you know, the tale here is just pretty simple, right? We're significantly off the national numbers, and we're even off the numbers compared to other jurisdictions like in New Brunswick or Manitoba. So, but to me, I see that a little bit, again, more symptom than the actual problem in and of itself. If, in fact, there were economic opportunities that the private sector felt were there and were ready to be exploited by virtue of additional investment, there may be some barriers to access to capital. I mean, all that you know, that old saw will always be there and absolutely needs to be looked at. I think the bigger driver on this one, frankly, is a sign, one way of the private sector telling us we don't see the economic investment opportunities on the same scale that we do elsewhere. I mean, capital will chase good ideas, and it'll go wherever they are. So the challenge to us, again, is on those ideas. Sorry. Okay, so this one, this won't surprise you at all, and I'll get to the end here and open this up. Same story, okay, so if we look at this, 87-2010, total employment on a percentage basis, and so you see Nova Scotia, you see the goods producing sector and service producing sector. So again, back to flashes of insight into the obvious. Over the past several decades, have we seen a change in terms of the employment related to the goods producing sector and the service sector? You're darn right we have, right? And again, for those in the room that come from some of the regions, you see the numbers in Cape Breton are stark, but they're stark everywhere else. There has been that fundamental shift. And look, there's been a move to a service-based and based economy throughout North America. That in and of itself isn't the issue. The issue is, again, I'm just going to keep pounding on this drum. The issue is the level of activity, the scale of activity. And if we had, you know, I'm not going to get hung up on that ratio, although like many people in the room, I expect, I do believe there is power in manufacturing industries for all kinds of other reasons that we can discuss. But I wouldn't be so hung up on this, on the ratio, were it not for the not seeing the growth on the total, right? So like, again, you can't boil the ocean here. There will be global changes, and we're seeing those in some sectors now, that absolutely will cause the run to end in a particular activity. So that's natural. That's going to happen. What I think we've got to keep challenging ourselves to say, again, back to this is not about getting a bigger piece of a smaller pie. This has to be about a bigger pie. And per the mandate that we have, it has to be a discussion about the distribution of that activity and those benefits throughout the province. So our objectives, which you may have seen some of yesterday, is as per the conversation we're having, is some of it is around, it's a public engagement process with the edge of a commission mandate, because at the end of this, we are going to say something. I hope we have, more light than heat, as they say in the recommendations, but we're going to say something about this. We're not going to equivocate. We're not going to, I think I can guarantee you one thing after spending 4 hours with my colleagues yesterday. This will not be a banal, sort of piece of neutral commentary that gathers dust. It may gather dust. I can't make that decision. But we just care too deeply. We're going to say something at the end of this, but we're also going to say something after having heard an awful lot of what people have to say, because we know we don't have this figured out. So anyway, I want to get on to this. This I thought was an interesting way, and I'm not sure exactly who said this first, but we all do this, right? I mean, when we get the sticky kinds of issues in our organizations or sometimes in our families, we sit down, even while we may not want to, and say, we need to have an adult conversation about this. And that's part of what we're here to do. And that's part of confronting, again, those brutal facts, our reality. Let's give it a big group hug, right? Because it's our reality. It's not anybody else's. But I'm not going to spend a lot of time quibbling over and pretending that the reality is something other than what it is. Because I think every time we look away from that, we miss an opportunity to deal with it. The opportunities, look, you come up with your own list on this. This was just, again, you can't, in doing these things, you can't do them without anticipating to some degree the naysayers, and there will be plenty. But you know what? There's a ton of opportunity out there. And I think everybody in this room knows that, and you know it in your part of the province way better than I do, or than any member of our commission does, unless you're talking about their particular part of the province. But there's just so much. I mean, think about it. I'd ask for the people that, particularly those who are native Nova Scotians or have adopted this province, who have been here for a while, take up that frustration that if you don't feel it, I'm worried about you. But that frustration that we all feel that this province can do better. We know that to the tips of our toes. And again, that's part of the reason why, we were peeved at Frank McKenna. Because he managed to spin a story about a province that we knew did not have the kind of capability and capacity that this one did. But that alone allowed them, you can quibble about whether it lasted and how real it was and all the rest of it. But again, let's be honest with ourselves. For a period of time, it certainly sparked private sector investment in New Brunswick. That is beyond dispute. So there's part of this that is really, I'm telling you, look, it is about our conception of ourselves, right? I mean, we've all, I'm not trying to turn this into a bad Hallmark card. I am not. But I'm telling you, if you can't see yourself in a better place, I don't give you very good odds of ever getting there. If you can't envision something better for this province, for your region, for your town, then I'm pretty confident that you won't see it. So if we've proven anything to ourselves, back again at least to my assertion of our inability to take a lot of the requisite pieces and not get them to fit together as well as they could, partly because we were the problem, right? We were not willing to collaborate. We were not willing to step out of the way or reduce barriers. And certainly if you go to the interprovincial level, we're experts at that in Canada. So we've proven that limits our growth. Let's do what the literary folks, from time to time will remind you. Willingly suspend disbelief, right? So that didn't work so well. So why don't we try something else? why don't we say there's potential here, we believe that this province has that potential, and we're actually going to take a run at seeing if we can get it. And that's certainly the kind of approach that we're going to take. And you know, we'll see where it comes out. Again, no magic answers. But for the life of me, I will not stand here and accept that there are no answers. I will not. I think there is. And so that's what we'll set out to do. Now, here's where we want to pick your brain. So I've covered that. So we'll town hall meetings and we'll get an interim report. And it's the standard process, so there's nothing magical about our process. But here's where we're asking for your help. I can go back to that if anybody wants to. Look, you live in this world all the time. And again, I'm trying to practice what I've been preaching here. I'm trying not to be naive or avoid confronting our brutal facts. And that is, it's hard to get people engaged, right? So one of the things we'd like to ask you to do in terms of at your tables and the nature of the process, I gather you've been doing it in the morning. So I want to give you a chunk of time now to do it, because there's another set of questions for another chunk of time. So you're only going to get about 10 minutes or so on this one, 10 or 15. But how do we get people engaged? And how do we grapple with that question of, at the same time, confront our reality, but to do so in a way that actually gets us motivated about the opportunities that exist? So which is not easy. We're, again, aware of that. That's why we're asking you for some help on this. And, you know, you think of all the community-based activity that you're involved in. I suspect some people in the room have some really good ideas on this. And then lastly, how do we encourage people to approach economic growth, again, in a new and innovative way? Let me be provocative, and I'll overstate this beyond what I believe. Look, it seems to me that we, like every other human, you know, group on the planet, we get stuck, right, in ruts in terms of our own thinking, right? I mean, you know, and just the change process, no matter whether it's about economic development thinking or anything else, you know, that old aphorism about the only person who really likes change is a wet baby, right? There's a fair bit of truth to that, right? I mean, it's just we get locked in pathways and it's hard for us to get out of them. So this question of how do we get people to approach the economic, this question of growth, this question of scale, how do we get out of some of our old traps? Because some of our old traps, whether they had merit or otherwise, they have at least contributed to the reason that we've not been able to get the scale that we needed. So those are the first set of 3 questions that I'd like to ask each of the tables. And if you'll hang in with me and zip through this quickly, because I got another set of questions. I'd love to open it to Q&A right now, but my fear is we'll never get to the questions. So if you can whip through these questions quickly in 2 sets, then we'll have time to do some Q&A. How's that for a deal? Okay, thank you. To several times, you know, how do we reduce the amount of energy we expend in competition with each other when we're all on the same team, right? Or maybe the question is, why don't we all feel that we're on the same team? But however you want to deal with it, that's fine by me. How do we advance innovation, productivity, and competitiveness? And then for that matter, you can drop the rest of it. My bias, I don't see how we meet the objective that I just spent a few minutes talking to you about around the increase in scale without going through productivity and competitiveness. I just don't see how you do it. And, you know, any of you that have read Kevin Lynch's stuff in the past couple of years on this issue, he says the same thing for Canada. And again, in Canada, you get all the benefit of the resource sectors, right, and the resources as a commodity that we're riding now, but he still says, on a Canadian basis, you can't get there without the productivity and competitiveness gains. So anyway, that one's going to be a key one. What's the place of small business development in our economic future? In many of our communities, again, the small business community is a big part of our economic base. So how do we frame that in a way that's going to be respectful of and involving the small business community? And the last one, if anyone gets an answer to this, they get a special star, a special prize. How do we help bring consensus around shared goals for growth? Because we've seen ample evidence, and many of you, I suspect, have lived through some of these development debates in your community where it is, you know, stop, go, right? And two sides just absolutely pitted, and no seeming way to break the kind of binary battle on it to get to something called consensus. So if anybody wants to opine around that one, then we'd like to get that as a result. So again, we're going to be in the same amount of time, so my suggestion is grab one or two of those questions at your discretion and see if you can make some progress in the next 10 or 15 minutes. And then we'll go to Q&A. Thank you.
What do you think some of the sharp edges we're going to have to work through might be?
Yeah, I think some of the sharp edges are embedded in those data sets that we presented to you, because you can look at that, and it's pretty hard to look at that and say where we are is okay. So that's one element, is just like we're going to try to be very data-driven as a commission. You know, one of the things that drives me absolutely crazy is the tyranny of anecdote, right? I mean, you know, like, you know, you add up 4 anecdotes and that's not data, and so we need to determine what is actually out there. So I think that's one piece. Second one for me would be. Look, I think we have to come to grips, and this has got to go both ways. So we've got to come to grips with the fact that we have a urban, regional, leading city in HRM, and that is a good thing. However, HRM's position can't be keep sending us your sons and daughters from the rural communities to help us with our labor market problems. So there's got to be a new construct for how we think about taking full advantage of having again, on a regional level, having an urban center that just has huge upside for us, and how do we make sure that we provide opportunity in every part of the province, and it can't simply be none of us really believe it's as simple as the rising tide lifting all boats, right? We don't. We know it's more nuanced than that. But in this province, as long as I've been around it, we've got to have rural communities being more comfortable and seeing the positive in having growth in Halifax, and we've got to have Halifax absolutely deeply concerned. Again, think shipbuilding being a good example about how do we get benefits around the province as a result of the activity in and around Metro. So that's a second category. The third category of sharp edges that I see has been, or it is and will be, around the development, don't develop debates. I'll put it in a big category, right? Is that, you know, we're in a part of the province, we're looking at opportunity, and the way we currently debate it, it gets polarized and we get stuck. We just can't press through it. And so even if all we got to, there are others, but those are the, just again, my top of mind, honest, big three, and that come out of my head.
Mr. Ivey, I'm Jack Kite from Pictou County. We had a panel this morning that was very, very encouraging. Some business leaders and some very thoughtful people. And we all came away from that panel very encouraged that the growth is there, it can happen. There needs to be leadership. What has the government indicated to you that they are willing to do to show leadership in terms of removing barriers that are now holding back companies from progressing in this province. What are they going to do to really show leadership to the extent that it might not get them reelected to make this happen if they care that much?
I think the minister's here. No, no. Look, what I would say to that, look, I mean, they've struck the commission. They've certainly indicated they've given us essentially complete independence from any of their processes. So, and they've indicated at least a mild interest in hearing what we have to say. And as I've described to you, we're not going to have any compunction about calling it in the way that we see it. However, we're in a process that's going to span a period of time. I mean, you've got Simone and others in the room today. Look, I think if I won't speak for you, Simone, but look, if there are identifiable barriers that are holding back either your community or broader swaths of the province, I'd say, look, we don't need to wait for this commission or anything else. I mean, let's identify them and see if we can deal with them. I think, look, I'm again, I'll just speak to you really honestly. I'm of two minds on, we always lament the lack of political leadership from our perspective. Well, we got to ask ourselves the question, is it always political leadership that's holding us back? Or by citing that, and I'm not suggesting you indicated that at all, but I'm reflecting my own comments. Or are we just in some ways letting ourselves off the hook, right? Because I honestly don't believe it's always the political leadership that is the constraining factor. If it is, call them on it, hold them accountable for it. They're more accountable than most of us because they got to put their name on a ballot. So that's great. But I'm going to keep pushing hard for each and every one of us, including myself, to ask the question of, what am I doing that potentially is holding us back from achieving the kind of scale that we've set today? And I'd ask everybody else to kind of do the same piece. So, an incomplete answer, but I think it's just another example of the stuff that we're going to need to work through.
Thanks, Ray. Keith McDonald from the Cape Breton Partnership. Education plays a big piece, especially PE to 12, into some of the barriers, and how active will the Commission be delving into the education piece through your process?
Well, look, it's a little bit like the real estate aphorism, right? Location, location, location. I honestly think we'll take an approach that's economy, economy, economy. Doesn't mean that we won't look at other factors. Education's not unrelated. But I want, again, to be respectful of you in the room. I think we will do a less adequate job if we get expansionist in the whole range of issues that impinge on your communities in this province. And frankly, that's also not our mandate. So as far as education and training relates to, again, meeting this fundamental challenge of how do we build scale in this province that we previously have been unable to do, yeah, it's in. And where I would see it, Keith, to be honest, is, and I'm really pleased to say this, it was certainly a holy grail for me in my time at NSCC, was, we did not have a college system on par with the rest of the country. It was as simple as that. We had missed a 20 or 30-year period. The good news is we've closed that gap. So we have, I think, in collective assets, leave Acadia aside, this is not a Acadia bias comment, I think we've got a post-secondary sector that would be the envy of virtually every province in the country. But having said that, I'll hoist ourselves, meaning the university and college sector, on the same petard I guess I'm asking everybody else to climb on, which is I think we can do more with that asset. I look at the work we've been doing the last couple of years. We've really worked hard at sort of living beyond our walls. And the example I like to use, because we went from virtually zero to now over 30 research projects supporting the grape growing and the winery business in the valley. Everything from, you know, chemistry, biology, nutrition, business, and, you know, if we scale up the amount that these institutions are there as resources for your communities, and I mean that by more than the programs they offer. I mean that by that kind of more activist approach. I think we've got an asset that would be the envy of many provinces in the country.
I just want to make a suggestion. It concerned me a bit when you said you weren't sure if it might end up gathering dust. So I just want to make a suggestion that if you don't want it to gather dust, make it so big, put it on every network during the supper hour newscasts, put it on Facebook, put it in the Herald, and most of your media partners are going to want to give you some free time because it's growing their advertising base if you're growing the economy. Make it so big that the opposition parties are not going to let the government walk away from it and let it gather dust.
Yeah, well, look, we had this conversation yesterday with the Premier, and it was absolutely clear cut from the Premier that, you know, this is a public process, and any document related to this process is a public document. So I actually, you know, it's just in the history of commissions and panels, etc., and sometimes it's actually the commission and the panel that creates this problem. You know, if you issue, I remember one of the federal ones when I was in Ottawa, you know, 150 some odd recommendations. I mean, come on, right? I mean, be realistic. I mean, so what's a government going to do? Spend its entire mandate implementing your recommendations? So, but I think, you know, that's where the concern comes from. So part of it's on our shoulders. I think if we can come up with a report that actually gets at some of the issues we've spent the last hour and a half talking about, I don't think we're going to have any trouble with it being used and not gathering dust. So, but again, I think given that we're asking so much of Nova Scotians in the process, in terms of the consultation, as we've begun with you here today, I think it's really important that we create that sense of ownership far beyond the commission and far beyond this room, so that, you know, as the report is finished, it's not just looking to government to implement it. It's all of us having a slice of it that we're going to be, you know, hopefully not just dying, if you will, to kind of get at it and move it along. So, I mean, it's easy to say that now because we're on the front end of this, but that's the target.
Just in closing, I guess, coming from the other side, Donna had at White Point, we need to be the change, and it's not about what you're able to come up with to be able to put forward for government. This is our economic plan. This is our opportunity to identify what we need, where our opportunities are. So I think your army on the ground should be everyone here, and our opportunity will be to take that challenge, to look at all those pieces and take that forward. Because if we don't, we can't blame anybody else for a lack of action or removal of dust on anything.
Yeah.
So thank you.
Thanks for that comment. And I haven't given Irene any time, but that question is just comments too good, given her background, not to give her a chance to make a comment.
I just want to say that yesterday, and thank you, yesterday the commission met for the first time, and that's when our names became public as to who the commission, all the names that who we were. And so as just happened yesterday, this today was an opportunity for me going by to be able to come and be part of some of your sessions. And I thought that what I got from what was presented here on the RDA, and so from where we stand in the commission, is that we are very much looking forward to speak to all of you, the municipalities, the RDAs, and other sectors of all the province, across the province. And we're hoping that we have, like Ray said, this dialogue that we will all be able to take and do something with, because the province of Nova Scotia, from Yarmouth to Sydney, we have entrepreneurs everywhere. We really do. And so if we support one another and find out what's needed, we will be able to change things around. And as the RDAs are restructured in different geographic areas, I think this is the opportunity to have a wider group of people talk about economic development. And some, yes, economic development will be in a region. And so we are very much looking forward to be part of all of you in those discussions.
Thank you, Ray and Eileen.